a fleet sailed from Spain, carrying the confidence of an empire. It had priests, soldiers, nobles, siege equipment, saints' banners, royal orders, and a mission that seemed almost providential. Cross the Channel, join an invasion army from the Spanish Netherlands, overthrow Elizabeth I, and restore Catholic rule in England. But the plan depended on something history rarely grants to grand strategies: perfect timing. The ships had to survive the English fleet. They had to hold formation through the Channel. They had to reach the waters off Flanders. They had to make contact with the Duke of Parma's army. That army had to be ready, protected, and able to embark. The sea had to cooperate. The wind had to cooperate. Communications had to work across hostile waters. Commanders separated by distance. Weather, tides, and uncertainty had to act as if they were standing in the same room. And when the moment came, the empire discovered that faith could bless a fleet, but it could not solve logistics. Welcome to the History Docket, where history's greatest disasters are reopened. Before we set sail into one of the most famous failed invasions in history, take a moment to like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and leave your verdict in the comments as the case develops. Because the Spanish Armada is often remembered as a simple patriotic legend, proud Spain humbled by plucky England, and a divine Protestant wind. But the real case is sharper, stranger, and more interesting. It is a story of politics, religion, intelligence, overconfidence, improvisation, bad assumptions, skilled seamanship, and a plan that looked magnificent on paper until it met the English Channel. This is the case of the Spanish Armada, the invasion fleet that reached England's waters but never delivered the invasion. The armada that could survive battle but not solve its central problem. The commander who warned that the mission was flawed. The queen who understood the power of theater. The empire that mistook reach for control. And the fatal gap between a royal command and the sea itself. Chapter 1. The Queen Spain could not ignore. By the late 16th century, England was not yet the world empire it would later become. It was a kingdom on the edge of Europe, religiously divided, financially limited, politically nervous, and surrounded by larger continental powers. Its navy was growing more dangerous, but it was not yet the obvious master of the seas. Its monarchy had survived crisis after crisis, but the succession remained uncertain. Its queen, Elizabeth I, had ruled since 1558, but she ruled in a world that did not consider her position safe, natural, or permanent. To much of Catholic Europe, Elizabeth's England was a problem. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a marriage many Catholics rejected as invalid. She had restored Protestant worship after the Catholic reign of her half-sister Mary I. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated her. That act did more than condemn her spiritually. It encouraged the belief among some Catholics that removing her could be treated as a religious duty. But Elizabeth was not merely a Protestant queen, sitting quietly on an island. England became a source of trouble for Spain. English privateers attacked Spanish shipping. Men like Francis Drake turned maritime raiding into a national art form, a political weapon, and a personal fortune. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe was not just an adventure. It was a humiliation to Spain because it struck at the idea that Spanish oceanic routes were secure. England also supported the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the Low Countries. That mattered enormously. The Netherlands were not a side issue for Philip II of Spain. They were part of his dynastic inheritance, a strategic frontier, a wealthy region, and a dangerous theater of rebellion. The Dutch revolt drained money, soldiers, attention, and patience. Protestant rebels in the Netherlands resisted Spanish authority, and England's support made that resistance harder to crush. From Spain's point of view, England was not merely heretical. It was disruptive. From England's point of view, Spain was not merely Catholic. It was threatening. The two kingdoms had once been linked by marriage. Philip II had been married to Mary I of England, Elizabeth's Catholic half-sister. For a short period, he had been king consort of England. After Mary died and Elizabeth came to the throne, Philip at first did not rush into war. His policy toward England shifted over time. He had many enemies, many obligations, and many reasons to avoid a direct invasion if it could be avoided. But the crisis deepened. One figure made that crisis more dangerous than almost anyone else: Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Catholic. She had a claim to the English throne. She became the focus of Catholic hopes and conspiracies against Elizabeth. After years of imprisonment in England, Mary was implicated in plots against Elizabeth and executed in 1587. For Elizabeth, it was a brutal act of political survival. For Catholic Europe, and especially for Spain, it was a shocking provocation. Mary's death removed one possible Catholic claimant, but it also intensified the moral case for intervention. To Philip II, England was now not only a heretical kingdom supporting rebels and pirates. It was a kingdom whose queen had executed a Catholic queen. The road to the Armada was not built in one day. It was built out of privateering, rebellion, theology, dynastic rivalry, diplomatic breakdown, and fear. The strange thing is not that Spain eventually attempted an invasion. The strange thing is how complex the invasion had to be, and how many pieces had to work perfectly for it to succeed. Chapter 2: The King and the Burden of Empire. Philip II was one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. He ruled Spain, Portugal after the Iberian Union, territories in Italy, the Netherlands, vast American possessions, and a global maritime system. Silver from the Americas flowed into his finances, though often not enough to keep pace with his wars. His empire was enormous, but enormous empires have enormous vulnerabilities. Philip's image is often reduced to that of a cold, fanatical bureaucrat sitting in the Isco Real, sending orders across the world. There is truth in the image, but it is incomplete. He was deeply religious. He believed in the defense of Catholicism. He was also cautious, patient, and administrative. He read documents obsessively. He wanted information. He wanted control. But the distance between royal paperwork and battlefield reality was vast. And the Armada would expose that distance. Philip's problem was not simply that England needed to be punished. His problem was that England could not be easily reached. A direct landing from Spain onto the English coast would be difficult and risky. Transporting a large invasion force across hostile waters required not only ships, but coordination, protection, timing, and suitable landing conditions. Spain had naval power, but the English Channel was not a Spanish lake. The more practical invasion force was already closer to England, the Army of Flanders. This army, commanded by Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, was one of the finest military forces in Europe. Parma was an exceptional commander. He had fought in the Netherlands with skill and patience. If his troops could be transported across the Channel, England would face a terrifying danger. So the plan developed around a union of forces. The Armada would sail from Spain into the Channel. It would secure the passage. Parma's troops would embark from the Spanish Netherlands in barges and transports. Together, the fleet and army would invade England. This sounds logical, until one asks the practical questions. Where exactly would the Armada and Parma meet? How would they communicate? What if the Dutch blockaded Parma's ports? What if the Armada arrived before Parma was ready? What if the English attacked before the junction? What if the channel weather changed? What if the ships could not anchor safely? What if the invasion barges were too vulnerable? What if the fleet had to fight and coordinate at the same time? In war, the most dangerous plans are often those that assume different forces can arrive at the same place at the same time under pressure, with imperfect information, in contested space. The Spanish plan required the sea to become a road, but the sea remained the sea. Philip's original choice to command the Armada was Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, a seasoned admiral with deep naval experience. But Santa Cruz died in early 1588 before the expedition sailed. That death mattered. Command passed to Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, Duke of Medina Sidonia. Medina Sidonia was a great noble. He was loyal. He was responsible. He was not a fool. But he was not the ideal commander for a vast naval expedition into hostile waters. He had limited experience commanding at sea, and he himself expressed doubts about his suitability and about the condition of the fleet. He warned of shortages, difficulties, and risks. This is one of the most revealing details in the case. The man chosen to command the Armada understood that the machine was not ready. But monarchies are not always good at hearing inconvenient truth when the decision has already been made. Philip insisted. Medina Sidonia obeyed, and the Armada moved toward its fate under a commander who had the courage to warn the king, but not the power to stop the plan. Chapter 3: The Singeing of the King's Beard. Before the Armada could sail, England struck first. In 1587, Francis Drake raided Cadiz. The raid became famous under a phrase usually remembered as singeing the King of Spain's beard. It was a dramatic insult, but it was also a serious military operation. Drake attacked shipping, destroyed supplies, and delayed Spanish preparations. Vessels, stores, and materials needed for the invasion were damaged. The attack did not prevent the Armada forever, but it bought time and disrupted momentum. This was English strategy at its most effective, not waiting passively for invasion, but striking the machinery before it fully assembled. Drake understood something essential. A fleet is not only ships. A fleet is food, water, powder, barrels, rope, sails, anchors, crews, schedules, and confidence. Destroy enough of those, and even the greatest royal project begins to stagger. But Spain did not abandon the expedition. Philip's decision hardened. The Armada was not merely a military operation now. It had become a test of imperial will, religious duty, and royal honor. Delay could be tolerated. Failure to act could not. Meanwhile, England prepared. Elizabeth's government understood the danger, but English readiness had its own weaknesses. Money was short. Mobilization was uneven. The Queen was cautious with expenditure. Coastal defenses were improvised. The English fleet contained royal ships and armed merchant vessels, a mixture of state power and private enterprise. Yet England had advantages. Its commanders knew their waters. Its ships were generally more maneuverable than many of the large Spanish vessels. Its gunnery tactics were different. English captains preferred to use artillery at range, damaging enemy ships without closing for boarding. Spanish tactics still placed more emphasis on closing, grappling, and boarding, where Spanish infantry could be decisive. This difference would matter in the Channel, where the Spanish needed to preserve formation and purpose, while the English could harass, strike, and withdraw. England also had commanders of real ability: Lord Howard of Effingham, Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, and others. They were not flawless heroes, but they were experienced seamen facing a threat they understood as existential. By the summer of 1588, both sides had prepared their stories before the battle had even begun. For Spain, the Armada was a sacred enterprise, an instrument of restoration, discipline, and Catholic monarchy. For England, the approaching fleet was a monstrous invasion, a foreign tyranny, a test of national survival, and a threat to the Queen, Church, and kingdom. But beneath all the symbolism lay a colder question. Could the Spanish fleet do what the plan required? Not simply sail to England, not simply survive English attack, not simply hold formation. Could it meet Parma? That was the hinge of the entire operation. And it was the hinge that would break. Chapter 4: The Armada Sails. The Spanish Armada that sailed in 1588 was enormous by the standards of its age. It included roughly 130 ships of different kinds: galleons, armed merchantmen, supply vessels, and other craft. It carried sailors, soldiers, guns, priests, nobles, and the hopes of Philip II. It was not a single uniform machine. It was a floating coalition of vessels built and adapted for a mission of extreme difficulty. From the beginning, the expedition struggled. Weather battered the fleet. Some ships were damaged. The Armada had to regroup and repair. Supplies were imperfect. Food and water were problems. Disease and discomfort were constant companions. The image of the Armada as a gleaming, unstoppable weapon hides the truth that early modern fleets were fragile ecosystems. Men lived in cramped conditions. Water spoiled. Food rotted. Powder had to be kept dry. Navigation was uncertain. Orders could be misunderstood. Signals could fail. A fleet is impressive from a distance. From inside, it is a city of exhaustion. Medina Sidonia had to bring this city north. He was not seeking a decisive battle for its own sake. His mission was not to chase the English fleet across the ocean. His mission was to preserve the Armada, reach the Channel, communicate with Parma, protect the crossing, and enable invasion. That meant formation was everything. The Spanish sailed in a defensive crescent, a formation designed to protect weaker ships and discourage English attacks. It was not stupid. It was a rational answer to the problem the Spaniards faced. If English ships came too close, Spanish soldiers could board. If the formation held, the Armada could continue moving toward its strategic objective. The English, however, did not need to break the Armada immediately. They needed to prevent it from doing its job. This distinction is crucial. In many popular versions, the story becomes a simple naval duel. English ships beat Spanish ships. But the reality was more complicated. The Spanish fleet survived repeated English attacks. It remained dangerous. It moved up the Channel. It did not simply collapse at first contact. The English harassed it, fired at it, searched for weaknesses, and tried to disrupt its movement. But they also struggled with ammunition, coordination, and the difficulty of inflicting decisive damage on large ships. For days, the Armada moved like a dark wall through the Channel, while the English fleet followed, attacked, and watched. It was a chase, a battle, a shadowing operation, and a waiting game all at once. And every mile brought the Armada closer to the real test. Parma. Chapter 5: Parma's Problem. Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, was not unprepared because he was incompetent. That is another myth too simple for the evidence. Parma was one of the most capable commanders of his generation. But his problem was almost impossible. He had an army in the Spanish Netherlands. He needed to get it across the channel, but he did not have a secure deep-water harbor suitable for the Armada. His invasion barges were vulnerable. Dutch forces controlled or threatened the coastal waters. The Dutch rebels, with their shallow draft vessels, could operate in places where large Spanish ships could not easily go. Parma's troops could not simply step onto ships and sail to England. They needed protection. They needed timing. They needed the Armada to arrive in the right place at the right moment. They needed the English fleet to be held off. They needed the Dutch to be neutralized. They needed weather and tides to cooperate. In other words, Parma's army was the dagger, but it was trapped in its sheath. The Armada was supposed to free it. But communications between Medina Sidonia and Parma were slow, uncertain, and vulnerable. Messages had to move through dangerous waters. The Armada could not linger indefinitely. The English were nearby. The Spanish fleet needed safe anchorage. Every delay increased danger. Here we reach the central failure of the operation. The Spanish did not lose because they lacked bravery. They did not lose because their ships were useless. They did not lose because every English decision was brilliant. They lost because the plan demanded a level of synchronization that the conditions did not allow. Philip could write the plan. Medina Sidonia could sail toward it. Parma could prepare under pressure. But none of them could make the channel behave like a corridor in a palace. This is where imperial power met physical reality. A king in Spain could command Parma to be ready. He could command the Armada to meet him. He could command the invasion to proceed. But he could not command tides, wind, Dutch blockades, English harassment, or the delay built into every message. The Armada reached Calais. It anchored there in late July by the English calendar, early August by the modern calendar. It had come astonishingly close to its objective. And yet at Calais, the weakness of the whole design stood exposed. Parma was not ready to join them. The English fleet was still there. The Dutch still threatened the coast. And the Armada, anchored and waiting, became vulnerable. Chapter 6: The Night of Fire. The English understood the opportunity. At Calais, the Spanish formation was temporarily fixed. The Armada was crowded near shore. The invasion still had not begun. If the English could break the formation, they might not need to destroy the entire fleet. They only needed to disrupt the fragile order that allowed the Spanish plan to remain alive. So they sent fireships. The fireship was an old weapon, but in the right circumstances, it had enormous psychological power. Ships packed with flammable material were set alight and sent drifting toward an anchored enemy fleet. In an age when ships were wooden, crowded, and full of powder, the sight of fire moving across the dark water could turn discipline into panic. The English fireships at Calais did not burn the Armada to ashes. That is not the point. Their real effect was to force movement. Spanish ships cut anchor cables and scattered to avoid the threat. The carefully maintained formation broke. The fleet was driven away from its anchorage. The Armada did not immediately cease to exist, but its ability to wait calmly for Parma was destroyed. A plan built on coordination had been attacked at its most vulnerable point. Not the hull, the timetable. The next day came the Battle of Gravelines. English ships pressed the attack. Their guns hammered Spanish vessels at closer range than before. The Spanish suffered damage. Several ships were badly hit. The formation could not be restored in the way Medina Sidonia needed. The Armada was pushed northeast, away from Parma and away from the invasion plan. Gravelines was not a complete annihilation. This matters. The English did not sink the entire armada in a glorious single stroke. The Spanish fleet remained a fleet. Many ships survived. The men aboard still had discipline. Medina Sidonia still had to make decisions. But strategically, the battle was devastating. The Armada could no longer perform its mission. It could not safely return to Calais and wait. It could not join Parma. It could not command the Channel. It could not escort the invasion. And because the wind and English pressure had driven it northward, the Armada faced an appalling choice. Try to fight back through the Channel against wind, enemy, and damage, or sail around Scotland and Ireland, taking the long road home through the North Atlantic. Medina Sidonia chose the northern route. It was the choice of a commander trying to preserve what remained. It was also the beginning of the Armada's worst suffering. Chapter 7: The Long Road Home. The English had helped stop the invasion. The sea would do the rest. After Gravelines, the Armada sailed north, around Scotland, then down the western coasts of Ireland, attempting to return to Spain. This route was dangerous even for healthy ships with good pilots and fresh supplies. For damaged vessels, exhausted crews, sick men, and navigators unfamiliar with hostile coasts, it was terrifying. The popular phrase, "the Protestant wind," would later turn weather into theology. But weather does not belong to one confession. Storms struck Catholic and Protestant alike. The point is not that God chose a side in meteorological form. The point is that weather exposed the vulnerability of a fleet already wounded by logistics, battle, fatigue, and strategic failure. Many Spanish ships were wrecked along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The Irish coast was especially deadly. Ships driven onto rocks, trapped in storms, or unable to find safe harbor broke apart. Survivors came ashore into a dangerous political landscape. Some were helped by local Irish communities. Others were captured, killed, or handed over to English authorities. The human cost of the retreat was immense. Imagine the experience from inside one of those ships. You have survived the Channel. You have survived English gunfire. You have survived fireships. You have watched the invasion fail without ever setting foot in England. You are sailing not toward victory, but toward escape. Food is scarce. Water is foul. Men are sick. The ship is damaged. The coastline is unknown. The winds are merciless. You do not know if home still exists as a realistic destination or only as a memory men whisper to keep despair away. This is where the Armada becomes less a battle story and more a disaster story. The failure was not only tactical, it was physical. Bodies, ships, supplies, and morale reached their limits. When the surviving vessels finally returned to Spain, they did not return as the invincible fleet that had departed. They returned scattered, battered, and diminished. Thousands of men had died from battle, shipwreck, disease, hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. Philip II received the news not as the end of his empire, but as a calamity inside a long war. That distinction matters. Spain did not collapse in 1588. The Spanish Empire remained powerful. The war with England continued. Spain rebuilt naval strength. The English expedition against Spain and Portugal in 1589, often called the English Armada, failed badly. The wider struggle did not end with one summer in the Channel. But the Armada of 1588 became something larger than its immediate military result. For England, it became a foundational legend. For Spain, it became a painful symbol of overreach, though not the end of Spanish power. For Europe, it showed that even the greatest Catholic empire could be resisted at sea. And for history, it became a case study in the fatal difference between a powerful plan and an executable one. Chapter 8: Elizabeth's Theatre. While the Armada struggled at sea, England prepared for invasion on land. Troops gathered, militias were organized, the fear was real. If Parma's veterans landed, the English army would face a severe test. The English navy might delay or disrupt, but the danger of invasion could not be dismissed. This is the context of Elizabeth's famous appearance at Tilbury. The Queen came before her troops in 1588 and delivered what became one of the most famous speeches in English history. The exact wording preserved in later versions has been debated by historians, but the political theater of the moment is undeniable. Elizabeth presented herself not as a distant ruler hiding behind walls, but as a monarch willing to stand with her people in the face of invasion. The line most often remembered about having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, belongs to the famous version of the speech. Whether we treat every word as exact or as shaped by later memory, the image became central to Elizabethan legend. And it worked because it answered a specific anxiety. Elizabeth was a queen in a patriarchal age. Her enemies questioned her legitimacy, her religion, her gender, and her authority. An invasion backed by Spain could have turned internal doubts into rebellion. So Elizabeth's performance mattered. It transformed vulnerability into defiance. But we must be careful not to let Tilbury swallow the whole story. Elizabeth did not defeat the Armada by speech. The speech became powerful because England survived the danger. Victories make speeches immortal. Still, the theater mattered. States do not survive on ships alone. They survive on legitimacy, morale, and the ability to make people believe that resistance is meaningful. Elizabeth understood image. She understood timing. She understood that monarchy was not only government but performance under pressure. Philip's theater was the Armada itself, vast, sacred, imperial, and meant to overawe. Elizabeth's theater was the queen among her troops, vulnerable in body, unshaken in will, wrapped in the language of national survival. Both sides understood symbolism. But at sea, symbolism had to answer to wind and guns. Chapter 9: What the English Did Right. It is easy to overcorrect the old legend. For generations, English memory exaggerated the Armada into a simple story of national destiny. Modern historians rightly complicate that story. Weather mattered. Spanish mistakes mattered. The invasion plan was fragile. Spain remained powerful afterward. But complication should not become denial. The English did many things right. They used intelligence and preparation. They harassed the Armada rather than rushing into a disastrous boarding battle. Their ships exploited maneuverability. Their commanders understood that the Spanish needed to preserve order and reach Parma. By shadowing, attacking, and disrupting, they forced the Armada to spend energy and ammunition while remaining under pressure. The English fireships at Calais were tactically clever because they struck at the Armada's formation and nerves. Gravelines was a hard-fought engagement in which English gunnery inflicted serious damage. English seamanship and command decisions helped prevent the Spanish from achieving their objective. Lord Howard's leadership mattered. Drake's aggression mattered. Hawkins' reforms and experience mattered. The English fleet was not an accident. It had been shaped by decades of maritime conflict, privateering, ship design, and strategic necessity. England fought as an island kingdom must fight when invasion threatens. by preventing the enemy from controlling the narrow sea. The English did not need to invade Spain. They did not need to conquer the Netherlands. They did not need to destroy every Spanish ship. They needed to stop the junction between Medina Sidonia and Parma. And they did. This is a crucial lesson in strategic clarity. Sometimes victory does not require total destruction. It requires preventing the enemy from completing the one action that matters. In 1588, that action was the crossing of Parma's army. It never happened. Chapter 10: What Spain Got Wrong. Spain's failure was not a failure of courage. Spanish sailors and soldiers endured terrifying conditions with discipline. Medina Sidonia, for all his limitations, did not behave like a coward. Parma was a capable commander trapped by circumstances. Philip II was not irrational to see England as a serious strategic problem. The failure was deeper. Spain built an operation whose central requirement was coordination across a hostile, unstable environment, without reliable means to guarantee that coordination. The Armada had to be strong enough to fight the English, but not so aggressive that it abandoned its escort mission. Parma had to be ready, but could not safely move without the Armada. The Armada had to communicate with Parma, but communication was slow and uncertain. The fleet needed anchorage, but safe anchorage was limited. The invasion barges needed protection, but Dutch forces threatened them. The English fleet had to be neutralized, but the Armada could not easily force a decisive engagement on favorable terms. Every part of the plan depended on another part, and the enemy only had to disrupt one link. This is the architecture of failure. A plan can be impressive in scale and weak in structure. The Spanish monarchy could gather ships, men, money, and religious purpose. It could command loyalty across continents. It could launch a fleet that terrified Europe. But it could not remove the operational contradiction at the center of the mission. The Armada was both shield and messenger. It had to travel, fight, wait, communicate, protect, and escort an invasion army it did not directly carry. It was asked to make Parma's army mobile, without having direct control over Parma's readiness. It was asked to dominate waters where the English and Dutch could interfere from different directions. And above all, it was asked to turn a military idea into physical reality in one of the most difficult maritime spaces in Europe. Philip's empire had reach, but reach is not the same as grip. Chapter 11: The Myth After the Storm. After 1588, both sides told stories. England remembered deliverance. Medals were struck, sermons were preached. The defeat of the Armada became part of Protestant identity and national mythology. The survival of Elizabeth's England could be framed as proof of divine favor. The wind became providence. The Queen became a symbol. The sailors became heroes. The island became chosen. Spain remembered suffering, sacrifice, and misfortune, but not necessarily final defeat in the way English legend imagined. Philip reportedly accepted the disaster with religious resignation, though later retellings have shaped his response. Spain continued to wage war. It remained a major power. Its armies still fought across Europe. Its empire still stretched across oceans. The Armada did not mark the immediate rise of British global supremacy. That came much later, through different wars, institutions, finances, colonies, and naval developments. It did not end Spain as a great power. That too is a myth. But it did mark a psychological turning point. For England, it proved that Spain could be resisted. For Protestant Europe, it became a symbol of survival. For Spain, it exposed the limits of imperial planning and maritime coordination. For the Dutch, it helped keep hope alive in their struggle against Spanish rule. For naval history, it demonstrated the increasing importance of gunnery, maneuver, and sea control, though we should not pretend that one campaign instantly created modern naval warfare. The myth is not useless. Myths survive because they condense real emotional truths. England had been in danger, the danger had passed, a mighty enemy had failed. A Protestant kingdom had survived a Catholic superpower's invasion attempt. Those facts mattered. But the History Docket is not here to repeat the myth. It is here to reopen the case. And the case shows something more unsettling than a patriotic miracle. It shows a great empire defeated not by weakness, but by complexity. Chapter 12, The Human Cost. In the grand story of empires, fleets become symbols so quickly that the men inside them disappear. But the Armada was made of bodies. Sailors hauling lines in storms. Soldiers waiting for a landing that never came. Priests hearing confessions below decks. Officers trying to read signals through smoke and distance. Gunners working with heat, noise, recoil, and fear. Sick men lying in cramped spaces as water spoiled and food decayed. Survivors of wrecks washing onto foreign shores, not knowing whether the people approaching them would offer bread or death. The English also suffered. Their sailors fought hard and were later treated with a negligence that darkens the victory. Disease spread. Pay was delayed. Veterans who had helped save the kingdom were not always cared for, as patriotic memory would later suggest. Victory at sea did not mean comfort on land. This is one reason national legends must be handled carefully. They polish suffering into glory. They turn hunger into courage, disease into sacrifice, and bad administration into background noise. But history owes the dead more than a flag. The Spanish who sailed with the Armada were not abstractions of Catholic power. Many were men following orders, serving king and faith, trapped inside a plan they had not designed. The English who fought them were not merely icons of liberty. They were sailors and soldiers facing fear, uncertainty, and a state that needed them more urgently than it rewarded them. The disaster belongs to strategy, but the suffering belongs to individuals. Chapter 13, The Verdict. So who is responsible for the failure of the Spanish Armada? The weather. Yes, but not alone. Storms turned defeat into catastrophe, especially on the long route home. But the invasion plan had already failed before the worst wrecks along Scotland and Ireland. Weather magnified the disaster. It did not create every flaw. Medina Sidonia. Partly, but not simply. He lacked the naval experience of Santa Cruz. He had doubts. He made choices that can be criticized. But he also inherited a nearly impossible mission, preserved the fleet through intense pressure, and understood the weaknesses better than the king wanted to hear. Blaming him alone is convenient but unfair. Parma, only in a limited sense. He could not magically move an army across blocked and dangerous waters. His problem was structural. Without secure coordination and protection, his invasion force could not simply appear beside the Armada. The English. They deserve credit, not because they annihilated Spain in the simplified legend, but because they understood the strategic target. They did not have to destroy Spain. They had to prevent the crossing. Their pressure, fireships, gunnery, and seamanship helped break the operation at the critical point. Philip II. Here the verdict becomes heavier. Philip had reasons to act. England was a genuine strategic and religious problem for Spain. The Dutch revolt, English privateering, and Mary Queen of Scots' execution all sharpened the crisis. But Philip authorized and pushed forward a plan whose practical difficulties were staggering. He trusted that command, faith, preparation, and imperial power could overcome the operational gap between the Armada and Parma. He was not foolish for wanting to solve the English problem. He was wrong to believe this plan could reliably solve it. The deepest culprit was the plan itself. It was too dependent on timing, too dependent on communication, too dependent on weather, too dependent on Parma being ready under blockade, too dependent on the Armada holding position under enemy pressure, too dependent on the assumption that a vast empire could coordinate a delicate operation across a hostile sea, as if moving pieces on a map. The Spanish Armada failed because the plan demanded precision from a world of uncertainty. And uncertainty won. Chapter 14, the case reopened. The Armada is often remembered as a battle between arrogance and freedom. That version is emotionally satisfying. But the real case is more useful. Spain was not merely arrogant. It was overextended, threatened, and trying to solve multiple strategic problems at once. England was not merely heroic. It was lucky, resourceful, financially strained, and deeply afraid. The weather was not simply divine intervention. It was a force that exploited human error. The English victory was not the birth of an empire overnight. The Spanish defeat was not the death of one. What happened in 1588 was narrower and more precise. A major invasion failed. A great fleet was damaged and scattered. An army never crossed. A queen survived. A king's plan collapsed. A legend was born. And beneath the legend lay the more enduring truth. Power is not measured by how much a state can assemble, but by whether it can make all the pieces work together under pressure. Philip II could assemble one of the most famous fleets in history. He could not make it meet Parma at the right moment. That was the difference between invasion and disaster. The Spanish Armada was not defeated by one cannon shot, one storm, one heroic speech, or one foolish commander. It was defeated by the widening gap between imperial ambition and operational reality. Spain had ships, soldiers, money, faith, and a king with a clear political objective. England had fear, resolve, skilled commanders, and the advantage of fighting to prevent a single crucial event. Between them lay the Channel, narrow on a map, chaotic in reality, and unforgiving to any plan that required too many miracles of timing. The Armada's tragedy is that it came so close to the theater of invasion, yet never solved the one problem it had been created to solve. And that is why the case still matters. History often remembers disasters as moral judgments. God favored one side, pride punished another, destiny announced itself in wind and flame. But the deeper lesson of 1588 is less comforting. Great powers can fail even when they are brave, rich, disciplined, and serious. They can fail because the plan is too complex, because communication is too slow, because an ally is not ready, because weather attacks the weak point, because the enemy only has to stop one thing. So what is your verdict? Was the Armada doomed by Philip's ambition, English seamanship, bad logistics, or the sea itself? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe to the History Docket as we reopen the next great disaster hidden behind a familiar legend.